All righty. Well, it looks like it's 9 a.m. and a few people are jumping on, but we will get started here with our typical welcoming welcome slides as people get started so they won't miss the main portion. But thank you all for joining us today for our second to last web as a part of this EV Smart program. We're really excited to have you all here today. We have a good lineup of speakers from EVgo. Thank you for coming today to talk with us about installing EV charging in our communities. So to get started, as always, we have our agenda, we'll have our welcome, and then we have, as I mentioned, Michael and Tom from EVgo here to talk to us about all the different aspects of installing EV charging in our communities. And then, as always, we will have a time for questions for our presenters, as well as discussion amongst ourselves. So as we're going through the presentation today, if you have questions, please throw them in the chat. We'll make sure that they get answered. And then when we get to that question and answer time, you can either participate with comments and questions in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions verbally. Either of those work perfectly well. But before we jump into our main portion of the presentation, we have our welcoming icebreaker question that we always do. And this one is asking you to think of a question that you have about installing chargers in your community. What is the biggest thing that you've been wondering, the biggest question that you want answered? While we have experts on today, now's a great time to get those answered. So throw those in the chat, as well as if you haven't already, please change your Zoom name to reflect both your name and the community that you're representing. And as a reminder, how you do that is in your little Zoom square, if you move to the right-hand corner, an icon with 3 dots should show up. And if you click on those 3 dots, a menu will pop up that will say something along the lines of rename. And you can rename yourself to reflect the community that you're with so that everyone knows who's on the call. And I'm seeing that people are already doing that, which I love to see. And then just go ahead and think of those questions and throw them in the chat. And while you're doing that, I do want to introduce, we have a new team member at GPI working on EV Smart, Muntas. And Muntas is here with us today. I believe she just came off camera. We're really excited to have Muntas here to further be able to support you all in your journeys towards EV readiness. Muntas, I don't know, did you have a quick something that you wanted to say?
I just want to introduce myself again. Hi, I'm Muntas, and I'm very excited to be joining both GPI and also to be working with all of you guys.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Muntas. And Muntas's contact information will be at the end of the presentation. So you will have that as well as a resource for you. All righty. Well, with that, I want to hand the reins over to our 2 wonderful presenters, Michael Lundquist and Tom Jones, both from EVgo. So thank you, Michael and Tom, for joining us here today. I'm realizing that I may not have given you permission to share your screen. So let me do that really quickly. Apologies. I should have done that from the get-go.
I'll see if I can try right now too. There's an option here. Okay, yeah, well, thanks for having us. Yeah, again, my name is Mike Lundquist. I'm Director of Project Management and Construction at EVgo. I'm actually from Minnesota, so it's kind of fun to chat with you all today, specifically with any questions you have in the EV world. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get kicked off here. The first 2 topics I was going to talk about are site selection, what to look for in a good site in terms of the customer, but also the site host, along with just general construction means and methods. And like Rebecca said, if you have any questions, please post them in the comments. And it sounds like we'll just address them towards the end of the call. Before we dive in, I just wanted to talk in general, some basics about just charging, just to make sure that we're all kind of know just the general different types of charging, mostly being just level 2 versus level 3. What we do at EVgo is mostly level 3, which is DC fast charging, but I wanted to break it down for you. Doesn't mean there's not one that's necessarily better than the other. It really just depends what you're looking for and to build in your, in your town. It really just depends on a couple different factors, which we'll get into, but here's the breakdown that I have just presented here. Is so on the left side here, we have level 3 DC fast charging. Essentially, you can get a charge in your car. It might take between 15 to 45 minutes to go from 20 to 80%. It's also dependent on how big the actual charger is that you're charging with and how much capacity your EV can actually take. That requires a 480 volt, 3-phase voltage to power those fast chargers. And they range from 25 kilowatt up to 350. 25 is pretty uncommon these days. You usually see between 100 and 350 kilowatt. And that's just because the size of the batteries are increasing, and we also want to increase or decrease the total charging time. The 3 different types of connectors we have there are CCS, CHAdeMO, and Tesla, which you might be hearing now called NACS, the National American Charging Standard. That's kind of taking over as the main charging type, which most suppliers of charging stations will be implementing as well. And for fast charging, usually you'll see them in urban, retail, and just general corridors as well, just kind of areas that they're high traffic where people want to come in, charge, and then get on with their day. With level 2, it usually takes between 5 to 7 hours to get a full range back. You can usually just tie into existing panels at the property using 240 volts. They max out at around 7 kilowatt. And they use a connector type called a J1772, which usually every EV that you can purchase usually comes with the adapter, or you can buy that adapter online. Pretty straightforward. And they're usually in areas in a workplace or multifamily developments, just because you have to obviously stay there for longer periods of time to charge. Again, there's not one right versus wrong. It's just kind of what you're preferring to see built in your area. And on the right, I just wanted to break down kind of the pros and cons of each. With level 2 charging, typically it doesn't require additional service to the property. You can usually just tie into existing power of a 120, 240, or a 208 panel. And with that generally means that there's no easement required either, since you already have power on site. You do not need to request additional service to come onto the property, which we'll get into later, but that can save you a lot of time when it goes to actually trying to get these things built. And with that, usually you only need an electrical permit required, since that's mostly the main scope of work that you're dealing with on that end. And from general inception to operational, excluding maybe the electrical permit side, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So, once you have an idea of where you want to be built, so the idea of, site layout to actually implementing these and going online could take about 6 weeks, which is a pretty short timeline. But then again, they're very basic chargers as well. And with that comes lower upfront costs, which also gives you kind of a lower return on investment. With the level 3 charging, which is what you see, us and Tesla and a couple others building across the country, that requires a new separate metered service to the property, mostly because it does require a 3-phase 480 volts power, which is provided by utilities 3-phase transformer, which is usually required to install an additional transformer on your property, along with the switchgear, which then powers the power cabinets and powers the dispensers. And right now, just for transparency, most switchgear is 1200 amp and up, or 800 amp and up even, are looking at 45-week lead times. So once you are deciding on going with level 3 charging and you figure out kind of a general game plan, one of the first things you'd want to really look to procure or find a vendor for is your switchgear. That makes sense for your design, as that will probably be your longest lead time item to get your site operational and open to the public. With level 3 charging, since you do require a new service line, there's more than likely you're going to need a new easement, unless if you can somehow tie off from an existing easement. It does happen, but it's less common, and usually that can take between 3 to 5 months to get easement language agreed upon between the site host and the utility. However, I know with most of you being the local jurisdiction themselves, hopefully you have a good relationship with your utility, be it Excel or a different municipality. So maybe you have some leverage there where you can kind of push to get easements executed on your sites a little bit more easily. In general, kind of the standard across the industry is 12 months from inception to operational. And that's just due to the lead times, permitting, getting the easements, and then just the general construction timelines as well. With that, it's higher upfront cost, but then again, it also is higher return on investment. So that's just kind of the basics on level 2 versus level 3. I'm sure you've heard of those. I'm sure you've heard of that jargon before, but just wanted to make sure that everyone was kind of aware of just the generals when we go into the next steps here. When I talk about site selection, it's more or less on the DC fast charging side of things. Level 2 is pretty straightforward. You don't really need to do as much due diligence. So the next slides moving forward is mostly on level 3 DC fast charging site selection. So site types, I'm not sure if you all are looking to build on, government property or the jurisdiction's property itself, but if you are also looking to build elsewhere in your town, kind of the areas that are most sought after from a customer standpoint are grocery stores, coffee shops, and convenience stores, just because obviously it gives them something to do during that 15 to 45 minutes of charging. They can go and run errands, grab lunch, what have you. Kind of the more amenities, the better. Seems pretty straightforward, but it's something you want to look into when you are trying to find a site that suits your needs. Less sought after are gas stations or non-retail. Non-retail being kind of a rest stop along the highway where essentially all you're doing is pulling off, charging, and then getting back in your car and get going. So a couple examples there of some grocery store or stores in general that I have for photos there. So yeah, key qualities of a good site. From a site host standpoint, you're going to want to look for unused space and landscaping for your supporting equipment. So again, with these DC fast chargers, you're going to need an equipment pad, which is going to house the switchgear, the power cabinets feed power to the actual dispensers, and a transformer. So that can take up to 4 to 5 parking stalls. So ideally, you'd want to find an area that has a larger landscape that you could utilize, ideally without trees that you wouldn't have to cut down. So when you're looking for your site, ideally you'd look for an area that's kind of more or less on the outer edge of your property, with landscaping area to set your equipment that would be adjacent to the actual stalls you'd like to use for your chargers. So more or less the tighter, the more efficient layout, the better in general. The next key quality is proximity to power, and usually you'll find power on the outer edges of your property, being it overhead 3-phase or transformers, and we'll get into that in a little bit later. But again, you're going to want to identify what you think would be where you'll be tying your site into existing power, as that will be kind of a leading factor as to where you're going to be actually building on site, since there's a lot of costs tied to tying into existing primary power. And again, that's usually on the outer edges of your property, which hopefully there would be some landscaping to put your equipment on as well. With that, flat parking areas and parking availability. Ideally, you'd want to find a parking lot that has tons of parking, and honestly, a little bit further away from the store entrance. EV drivers would prefer to walk an extra 100 yards to a store entrance and be able to charge versus being closer to the store entrance and having your parking spaces be iced being internal combustion engine. So ideally, you'd like to find a parking lot that has tons of parking availability for your chargers. And with ADA, more and more jurisdictions are trying to be compliant with ADA path of travel and just general slope. So you'd want to make sure that the slope for your parking spaces really doesn't exceed 2 to 3%, as that's the standard in the industry right now. Just going down the list here, we have safety. You want to make sure that it feels safe at night with lighting and cleanliness. It doesn't hurt to look at your crime report indexes too, to see if there's one areas over the other that makes more sense. But again, you should have it well lit, so that way when you're charging at night, you feel safe, and it's an area that you'd be fine with having your partner charge alone in the middle of the night. Presence of tenants that enhance the EV driver experience. Yeah, you don't want to really build in a mall if 90% of the mall is vacant. You want to look for areas that there are amenities. Again, it's I think the two most important things for customers are how many chargers are available, Usually, obviously, the more the better. I think 6 is kind of what 6 is kind of what the average is these days, along with amenities as well. And high utilization at existing sites nearby. So, drive around, see what if there is other chargers in your town, see if they are being highly utilized, or if they're in areas that don't seem to be really efficient, and just kind of use that as your own data that you can kind of gather to see what parts of town make sense for yourself. And additional customer considerations is 24/7 access. Visibility from the road. You don't really want to have to pull off and start driving through a parking lot for 10 minutes trying to figure out, where these chargers are. The more visibility with direct access off of like a main city or state maintained road, the easier for everybody. We recommend close to highway or urban densities just because it's higher foot traffic. And free parking. You don't really want to have to pay to park and then pay to charge. It's kind of a double dip, and it's really, not ideal. Oh, I wonder what happened there. Sorry, I've got a slide that mixed up here. Give me a second here. Okay. So I make sure that this is in order now. So an important part with site selection really is the utility side of things. And I just wanted to touch base on just in general, what to look for. This may be common knowledge for most on the call, but just wanted to touch base on it really quick. That being that in order to get DC fast chargers available to your site, you are going to need 3-phase power from the utility, assuming it's probably Excel or another municipality. But in general, there's a snip here of what to look for. You can see that you would require a 3-phase. This is a 3-phase overhead utility pole with some communication lines tied to it as well. You want to make sure you know the difference between comm cables and power. But it's pretty straightforward once you are doing site selection, walking around on sites. It's pretty easy to identify poles that have power and poles that don't. But it's something you want to definitely look for, because when you are initially creating your site selection, you're going to want to be able to pitch your location to the utility, and having an idea of where you think power will come from will definitely help. And confirming that with utility upfront is important. If they say, you're going to have to build elsewhere or 300 yards further down, then it's going to, change your whole design and everything. So identifying what you think would be where power is coming from is kind of a step one, and then confirming that with the utility is step two. So continuing on here, just another example of a 3-phase utility pole on the right there. That's pretty common across the country. Some are a little bit more robust, but it shouldn't look too shocking to anybody on the call. But that's essentially what you'll want to be looking for when identifying where you could potentially be transitioning off of a pole to go and feed your site. A couple tips there. It says to stay away from poles that have existing transformers. Usually that means that those little metal cans you see on the top of the pole, if it's kind of a busy pole, as they call it, there's a good chance that the utility won't be able to come off of that pole and would have to go to the next utility pole to come down to feed your site. I believe we're sharing these slides, so I won't just read off every single bullet point here, but there's just some good basic rules to consider when you're just looking to identify power. And again, once you do kind of have an idea, if you can have a site walk conducting with your utility rep, even better, because they'll be able to confirm where they think they have capacity. But it's best to do kind of upfront due diligence on your end. You don't want to design a site, on the edge of a target property and find out that power is coming from 500 yards away, and you kind of have to start all over. So. And then instead of the 3-phase overhead, a lot of newer towns are going away with less overhead and more underground runs. So a good indicator is finding transformers in the area. And if you see a transformer, there's a good chance that there's a loop running in that area, and that they can tie off from that underground run to go ahead and feed your property. So this is a couple examples of what a transformer looks like. Essentially, if you're to go to the backside of a Target or a Walmart, you'll see a large transformer like this. It's essentially what you want to look for, as that will be another good indicator of potential power and potential capacity in the area. So what makes an easy site to build? We kind of talked about this earlier, but large landscaping, it really could save you a lot of money if you're not trying to tear up a parking lot, much less it's less disturbance for the site host, be it the site host being yourself on the call. In general, if you can make it happen, it's ideal to build your equipment pad in landscaping, along with actually the dispensers behind curb. The less actual earthwork you have of tearing up someone's parking lot or going through the middle of a parking lot to build it, the cheaper it's going to be all around. Big stalls and large parking lots. Assuming you want to have an ADA parking space, you're going to have to probably restripe some of your parking spaces to make a 15-foot wide ADA spot. But again, a large parking lot is ideal. You don't really want to go into an area like a McDonald's where they only have X amount of parking stalls, and if you have to take, say, 10 parking stalls to create 6, you're actually losing your parking stall count, and in some cases you might have to do a kind of a parking lot, I can't recall the name right now, but a parking lot study to see if they have enough parking stalls remaining in that property based off the square footage of the actual store itself. So larger parking lots, the better, usually less issues there, less headache. We have under 100-foot conduit runs. This is really important, especially on, it's called the secondary side of our work, which is more or less going from the switch gear, running secondary cables from the switch gear to the power cabinets and the power cabinets to the dispensers. The most expensive run, as they call it, is that secondary side. So you really want to condense your actual footprint, and also you can lose optimal charging when your power cables go beyond more or less 100 to 150 feet to feed the dispensers. If you're maxed out, if you're rated for 150 kilowatt dispenser, it can start to have degradation. But for the most part, it is a cost factor as well. Those high powered cables are not cheap, and you have to run a lot of them if you're assuming you're building more than one stall. So again, you want to keep it nice and condensed. And another big one is avoid third-party easements like the plague. If you have to go across, say, a Starbucks or a Caribou Coffee in order to feed your site with power, it could take months. It could never happen. Usually the third-party host has no incentive to really make it an urgent issue for them, since it's really not. It could technically bring in more people into their store, but for the most part, it's just a headache of paperwork. And in all honesty, if the only way to power your sites is to go through a third party in order to get your easements on the property, I would probably look elsewhere. We try to not build any sites with third parties, and if we have to, it usually delays the process. Can be pretty agonizing. So again, work with your utility to see to avoid them at all costs. Sometimes it's not an option, but usually they can get creative and figure out a way to power your site. Again, staying close to high voltage equipment. Like I said, with either 3-phase overhead poles or transformers in the area. And avoid crossing major roads with primary runs. Usually you can find power on your side of on your side of streets. The last thing you really want to do is have to work night shift in order to either bore or trench, more likely bore underneath an existing road. It just it can be more permitting, more reviews, more costs, and again, there's usually a better chance, or there's usually a better chance than not that there is power on your side of the road. So just do what you can to keep the power that's supplying your site to start on the side of the road that you're building off of. And there's a couple other considerations there as well. But again, I think these slides will be shared with you after this meeting as well. So that was kind of the first half of what I was going to talk about, is kind of what makes a good site from a customer, but also from a site host. And the second half that I was just going to go through more or less, probably a little bit more quickly, is construction means and methods. And again, if you have any questions, please post them in the comments, or if you really, it's pretty relaxed forum. If you do have questions, you feel free to interrupt me as well, but it sounds like there'll be time at the end of this call. So I just wanted to dive in here on construction means and methods for DC fast charging, and just general order of operations. So from the time a site starts construction to the time it goes operational is generally 3 to 6 months. And I would say about 70% of that timeline is really dependent on the utility and their schedules and getting them out there to do their work. So the earlier you have conversations with your utility and the more engaged they are, the better chance you'll have of getting your site operational in a tighter timeline. Every utility varies. Excel's usually pretty great, along with the other utilities in Minnesota that I've worked with. But again, just have them aware of your site, having them at the pre-con discussing their schedule to make sure you're all in sync. That really does take the longest time for the most part, is getting the utility out there to do their primary work, to run their primary line from existing power, to set their transformer and to energize the site. So highly recommend you engage them early and upfront. And then, just basic construction at that point. It's excavation and civil work, followed by conduit installation. Once your conduits are installed, you do some concrete pouring, let it cure, and then you restore the site as best possible as you are still in construction. After the concrete is set, you'll want to set the equipment, pull wire, terminate, and then, as I was saying before, then the utility would come out after all your inspections are approved by the city for your work that you've done to date. The utility come out there and do their primary run. Sometimes the primary run is actually they make the person, the host, actually do the work, so it might fall on your contractor to do the primary run, but more often than not, it's with the utility. Then they'd energize the site and commission and then open to the public. So that's kind of the basics there of the construction means and methods. And then the next few slides, I just wanted to show some photos of kind of what that looks like. The example I went with was we have a site in EVgo in Target, Roseville. I grew up in Maple Grove, so this one's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's somewhat close to where I am from, so it was kind of fun to work in this project when we built it a couple of years ago now. As you can see here, this is kind of just an aerial shot of where we built on the property. You can see Target, the store entrance is right here, and we purposely chose kind of the back corner of the lot. Again, it was because we're closer to primary power, and also because these parking spaces are less utilized, so that there's a better chance that some person with a gas car isn't just going to park there. So that's kind of the two main criteria as to why we chose this location. And it's also right off a couple major intersections too, close to 35 and all that. So this is just kind of a plan view of this little section right here. You can see we have 2 chargers for these 2 stalls, and then 2 chargers for these 4 stalls. And the reason for that being is these 2 chargers down here are 350 kilowatt. So if 4 cars were to go in and occupy those spaces at the same time, they would more or less power share, dropping that down to 175 kW per charger per car. But again, most cars don't really have the capacity to take over 200 kilowatts to date. There are some exceptions. But again, you can see here, these are 4 chargers supplying power to 6 potential EV stalls. And on the back side here, you can see this is where the transformer would be set, this box right here. Just north of there is the equipment pad with 2 power cabinets, which is supplying power to the whole station, along with the switch gear, which is where the feed from the transformer feeds into. And all these black dots is just bollards to protect the site from anybody accidentally hopping the curb and damaging our gear. So pretty straightforward build. This is just a plan view. This is just 1-page cut sheet of the actual permitted set of drawings that you go to use to build your site, but just wanted to give you kind of an idea of what it looks like from an aerial standpoint. The first phase here, this is the actual Roseville site, is excavation. Usually they want to keep a pretty clean, tight construction site. As you can see, there's some orange fencing up here, but there is actually some rigid metal fencing in the background as well. Excavation civil work can take roughly about a week, more or less, depending on how big your site is. After that, you'll do the conduit layout and install. You can see here on the left, this is the actual equipment pad that would feed the power cabinets here and the switch gear right here. This is a dispenser right here that's going to feed these stalls. Same with the conduit stub ups for dispenser right here to feed these stalls. Kind of tricky to see, but wanted to just kind of show you what it looks like before it's actually a finished product. After that, like I said, there'd be conduit placement and curing. So this is one of the dispenser pads right here, another dispenser right here. And again, this is the equipment pad you can see here with the bollards that are installed in place as well. And again, with concrete placement, curing, and restoration, that's usually about a week timeline as well. From there, you can see we're setting the equipment and putting on the bollard sleeves. You can see here's the power cabinets right here. This is where the transformer would go. Here's one of our dispensers at the end of stall. Setting equipment and wire pull and terminations again can vary, but it's usually roughly about a week or so, give or take. And then after the wire is pulled and terminated, this is kind of a finished site look. This is just a drone shot from that target. As you can see, the actual transformer isn't set here yet, but that'd be the last step would be, we got our final inspections approved by the city. We'd scheduled the utility to come out there. They'd set that transformer right here, energize the site, and then it'd be commissioned and open to the public. And that's generally like how a site runs, and that's more or less how the construction should look. And again, the 3 to 6 months timeline is really dependent on the utility. Usually you can do your site work, being the non-utility scope of work, in 4 to 6 weeks, just depending on various factors. But that's just in general what I want to discuss with you all today on site selection and construction. Tom, I'll hand it off to you if there's no questions right now. I'm not sure, Tom, are you going to share your screen or you want me to keep going?
Can I just tell you to change slides?
Yeah, sure.
All right, cool. Oh, this is still your side, contracting best practices.
Oh, that must have been okay. Yeah, I'll run through this one.
You can also skip. I mean, we already went over all this stuff, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. Hi, everybody. As noted, I'm the regional director for pretty much all of North America. If it doesn't touch the Pacific Ocean, I oversee it for EVgo. And I'll be going over some of the contract negotiations, a lot of things that we take into account with them. But in the simple and short of it, EV site contracts, especially in the DC fast world, are complicated. We generally try to follow a real estate foundational model. Because we are leasing spaces from a lot of these hosts. We may be purchasing land and then setting up a lease with an LLC on that. That's just normal business practices. We might be leasing land from a local city or township and building a hub, or they're looking for a certain number of chargers to be built there for their community. There's a lot of different options, but there's a lot of things that go into the pieces of the contracts that we don't see traditionally in a real estate model, that draws out a lot of the negotiations that we have with a lot of the different hosts. One of those being is we try to tie in a lot, the major factors being that we, like Mike had already touched on, where the utility connections are, square footage of the site design, what the term links are going to look like, and termination relocation rights, access rights to maintain and service. And we have to take into consider anything that's designated by that local AHJ or the utility. There are certain things that might come into play that we need to make sure are included into the contracts. And one other major factor is grant programs. So this is a very expensive project. There's a high cost to installing this kind of infrastructure in an area, and it's often subsidized with grant programs. So a lot of those grant programs have other items that need to be within the contract terms. So that adds a layer of, a layer to the contracts in order to get things approved with the hosts. We have to take into considerations, tenant agreements, etc. Tenant agreements, other easement issues. We try to stay away from third parties, as Mike mentioned. So there's a lot more that goes into it. Longer lease terms are also becoming a, see, we discussed level 2 station installation in today's presentation. Yes, we can. Longer lease terms are becoming more prevalent as costs associated with site construction increase across the country. For example, a major department store on average costs about $200 a square foot, while the DC fast charging stations can often be about $650 a square foot. and sometimes much higher, as they're also being anchored to a utility. So we look at ourselves as more of an anchor tenant when you're dealing with DC fast charging, while L2s are much more easily relocated, because they're often working off of host power, and you can find different locations on any different site to connect to at a later time. Next slide. So major examples of the variables within the lease agreements are as follows. Lease terms from 5 to 20 years. L2s we generally see as shorter contract term length. This primarily deals with the fact that L2s don't last as long. When you're dealing with that kind of power, you're dealing with a 50 kW unit all the way down to a little 50 kW unit that you'd see at home, to sometimes items that are a little bit hardier, but they just don't last as long. And so those contract terms are often tied to either the host can buy out the equipment after a certain amount of time, depending on the local jurisdiction and state law. It might be they just hand it off to the city and they can maintain it from there, because as the technology is constantly changing, supply chain also, it causes issues when it comes to replacement parts, etc. Or we have contracts in certain areas where we have to sell them to them for $1. But a lot of the times too is a lot of L2s cost at minimum just to get installed with contracting and everything else, and the amount of cost for supplies, about $10,000 a unit. So it adds up very quickly for a trickle rate, as you saw in the earlier slides. An L2 charger is roughly going to take about 6 to 8 hours to fully charge a car. The high power DCFC chargers, you're generally seeking 10 plus year term leases. Reason being is because depending on the speed in which the charger is and the population density, you're going to see an ROI around year 7, generally speaking. And that also is dependent on the utility rates in that area, so it might be longer. So most companies are trying to find a way to make sure they have a return while also meeting consumer demand. Because a lot of companies that are doing this right now, they're not doing it just for profitability. They're doing it for a mission. They're trying to help embrace, get the country to really embrace EVs and making that change. There's a cause behind everything. And another item that causes those term lengths to be longer would be longer or shorter or funding programs. So some funding programs require a minimum amount of time for those chargers to be in site, installed and operational at a certain uptime in order to maintain that funding without recourse. So if we tried to build a site and we had a term of 5 years and we decided we wanted to remove the stalls at 4 years, then we're gonna have to pay back all the money that we put in. So it's just ensuring that we're maintaining the equipment with the funds that we get. That's fine. We're good to work with that. We generally want these operational for much longer, and we as a company, for our fast charging side of the business, we're moving more towards a 20-year model. Bill windows and contract, you're going to see a variable on this all the time, from 9 months to 4 years or more. I don't know particularly the Minnesota market and each utility very well, but I know through different parts of the United States, this can be, if all the stars align. So 9-month bill term is generally where we sign the contract, things are moving in place, where we're doing our due diligence, checking on the site, pulling all of our information. We have established relationship with the AHJ, or the AHJ has already had established processes in place that they want to see with an EV charging station, be it L2 to DC fast charging. They have that readily available. We can work with all that. The utility already has things in place. They have supplies that they need in place. So everything can basically get lined up, and it's just a couple weeks of actual construction time to go into as well. So those are happening more often, but it's not everywhere yet. Longer build times are often attributed to redesigns acquired by the utility AHJ. That's okay. We're finding as we're continuing to expand into more markets, both L2 and whether it's a requirement for L2s to be in an area, whether or not they want to supplement L2s with DCFC, just having that open communication and education, something like we're having right now, but we'll regularly answer questions. It's okay to support what's capable, what's possible, what roadblocks we would run into, what the all scope of building and the needs we have in order to actually operate there, and then how that fits within the local community's desires. So the other item is the capacity constraints. So we might have communities that really want EV charging, but say they want to add it, say DC fast charging, you're talking about a brand new building, effectively pulling that much power, a manufacturing facility. It's a lot of power. L2s, well, if they have a building that you're just attaching to host power, but they don't have the capacity to add more L2s, where they're at capacity. If that area is actually at capacity, then they can't even add the L2s. We ran into this in New Jersey, where it was a brand new shopping center. Planning and zoning had approved all these new build plans. Capacity is now off the table for 5 years. So that hinders everything in that area for an extensive amount of time. So understanding what the true capacity issues with the utility also puts constraints on our build windows and sometimes our contractual timelines, because that can often kill a contract. We revisit in the future because times change, technology changes, and the hosts, like, they could be sold to other entities at the time. Supply chain shortages, it's a real thing. We are running into supply chain shortages when it comes to transformers, equipment. As more manufacturing is being brought in the United States, that's actually putting a large load on capacity studies, and we're competing for transformers. And that's like from new building developments, manufacturing facilities to EV charging, the list goes on. Utility and AHA staffing constraints. This is a real thing. We understand it, and it's about being open and honest. As more and more companies come about in the EV world, whether it's L2, whether it's contractors selling equipment, whether it's DC fast charging, there is a lot more paperwork coming through to push for this, especially as federal funding and sometimes make ready funding comes about. So that often can lengthen the amount of time to go through everything, and making sure companies establish a good relationship and that open communication is there allows everybody to plan accordingly. So like, we don't have to worry about stuff getting started. We can communicate that clearly with hosts, and hosts are aware that this is the timeline it's actually taking place, because it not only is, if it starts with a staffing shortage, but it's a problem that's known. So people might be, and communities might be trying to staff up, and we need to give them that time and respect that time, because nobody's going to come in guns a-blazing knowing exactly what they need to do. So that's a key factor for a good charging company to come in and have those discussions ahead of time, and then they communicate that to the hosts, and that reflects in the contract and in the contract terms. And then once again, new funding opportunities are pursued. So there's constantly grants, make ready, other programs popping up from statewide, federal, sometimes local, that are in the process. While we might be currently under contract, but that's now become available. So it might extend out the contract timeline. So there's a lot of moving parts. So we're going to need to talk to, the various permitting office to make sure we let them know that, hey, this is coming available. Can we get an extension? Or to the utility, can we make sure this stays in place? The list goes on, but because it's so expensive to build these sites, that is a constant where we're looking to see if we can have something to supplement that. And at the end of the day, things get far more complex and complicated. Contracts range anywhere from 2 pages to easily over 200. We have L2 contracts in the past, and we know other companies. We have colleagues in the industry that their leasing contract is 2 pages. It lasts for 5 years. It's super simple. It's in and out. It's totally turnkey. It leaves it very vulnerable to a lot of interpretation. It makes most lawyers' heads spin. But then we have a more in-depth contracts that are over 200 pages. Next slide. So the following is an example of us working with an AHJ, brand new in the community. This is down in Chesapeake, Virginia. This is a target location. This is their first site that's not designated. Their current policies they had in place that only EV fast charging could be done at gas stations. Well, that was very limiting because there's an environmental issue. There is constant concerns about the way things were originally designed. Is contamination of the ground, electricity and gasoline don't mix well together. The original design, a lot of these gas stations just made it incredibly difficult. So this is actually the second DC fast charging site in the city. And we worked with them hand in hand when they started going through. We'll be involved in public planning hearings where we can answer questions to the community. They wanted to make sure they match the aesthetics for their community. So we worked hand in hand with them in that. The key thing, and they wanted to take care of their community, this disabled community. So they wanted to ensure that we had a good ADA path connected to the site. So we worked with them. It was super easy. Did it extend the timeline? Absolutely it did. But the big thing that we needed to do was make sure we educated them, because they really wanted to bring this to their community. They wanted to provide this as a service and amenity. And we have signage, we have marketing that they've asked us to put up. We put that up. We've reached out to local other shopping centers, other business owners, and I mean, there's a lot of extra work that go into it, but we want to make sure that everybody's aware that this is coming to the city, and it's going to be easy for them to access. It's in between a Target and a Chick-fil-A, so a lot of people are really happy about that. But it was really nice to just educate and answer questions. So, but a lot of these extra features, we had to go back and forth with Target, being the landlord, to make sure that they were okay with some of these terms that we had to have in the contract about maintaining landscaping, etc. Because these are additional add-ons. Our contracts we are not there to take care of the landscaping. The primary host is. But just making sure that was building that strong relationship and connecting them with the site host as well. But I mean, it worked out. It just takes a little bit longer to get these communications and educate a lot more. We don't run into as much with L2s. We have stepped away from the L2 design more, just because of the uptime and the speed in which a lot of those units can fail, the fail rate. And that's why we're focused primarily on DC fast charging. So, that's all I got. Any questions?
Great. Thank you to both Mike and Tom for the wonderful presentation and the great information. I really liked how you were stressing to be reaching out to your utility early and often. We say that exact same line, so it's always great to have it repeated by others. We do have some questions in the chat, and so I'll just verbalize them if you want to. I'll let whoever decide who wants to take it. But the first question that we got is, where should the city draw the line on installing public versus private charging stations? I think some communities are struggling with, if they should provide that amenity or not, and what's the implications of, they're not trying to get in the gas station business.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's kind of a tough one to answer too. I guess I would start by seeing what all charging is already provided in your town and see what kind of the demand is in the area. But there is some maintenance and oversight that goes into kind of owning a station, be it L2s or otherwise. But yeah, I would, I think it really kind of depends on what's currently existing in your town, and at the least, what I've been seeing in a lot of other towns is that they do provide level 2 chargers. Granted, it's not usually for free, so there is, the city is making at least some sort of revenue stream on that. Be it at libraries or at the government centers or community centers. But yeah, I would just look to see what's kind of what's existing already in Brooklyn Park and kind of go from there. It's a it's a tough line to draw. And like you said, you're not in the gas station business. We get that. There is some maintenance, and once the sites are operational, you're not just, it's not a set it and forget it type of thing. You do have to kind of keep an eye on it to make sure they're running smoothly. So yeah, it's kind of a gray area, honestly. It really does depend on how much EVs you have in your area and what already exists out there. I'm not sure, Tom, if you have anything else you wanted to add there.
I have to say that, like, especially if the community is taking care of a lot of the charging, it's in those major like community draws. So we're talking downtown areas where you have, parallel street parking kind of thing, where you're providing an L2. These are major restaurant districts and things like that. That's a nice amenity. There's a lot of communities that like that. From the private side, especially if it's anything DC fast charging, those are generally going to be looking for all public access. We require, as a company, and we know a lot of the other big companies too, they require public access to everything. So there's a difference between whether or not, if the community wants to offer that, what's the major draws to those centers? Like Mike mentioned, your libraries, community centers, but also parks. So if there's local parks, state parks, city parks that have easy access to power, those are great areas too. For a lot of EV owners are going to be gravitating towards green spaces, and it just depends on what your community really is looking for. It may be you're providing it, or you're allowing companies to come in and provide that within the community as well. So just up to you.
Great, thank you. The next question is, are there ways that the city can keep consistency with payment methods and charging rates within the community?
So I would say yes and no. So if you have DC fast charging, say, already in your city, and you have 100 kW chargers and 350 kW chargers, you're going to kind of be paying a premium for the faster charger opportunity, since you can charge your vehicle at a faster pace, even if it's the same amount of kilowatts you're taking in at the end of the day. If it takes you 20 minutes versus 4 hours, you're kind of paying for that, paying that premium in order to charge your car faster. So you could either have, just level 2s across your entire city with the same charging rate, which would be easy then to just apply the same, price per kilowatt. But it's something you want to work with your utility as well, just because they're going to be charging you based off of the size of your switchgear or transformer when you are installing these. But yeah, it is a tough thing to balance as well, because it really does depend what size charger they're going to be charging with, and then you kind of would pay a premium for faster charging. Tommy, any?
Yeah. So this is something that we have different team. We have a whole department that's dedicated to this at the company. This is one of those things that if you're going to be communicating with your utility, I don't know if anybody here with a utility, or is this just okay? There's still a disconnect. There's still a disconnect in the times and the education. You should still consider this industry and this as like still novel in the grand scheme of things. Because we've had utilities that come back, you're like, you know what? I've been reading the news, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this. This is an actual quote. You've been really big in the news, and EVs are really growing, and I'm seeing that growth rate. We really want to start charging $1 a kilowatt hour. Well, if $1 kilowatt hour, that would turn that Nissan Leaf into, or that Tesla, let's just say a Tesla Model 3, it would cost $80 a time to recharge. And then that's just going to kill the EV industry. A lot of the contracts that we work out and those rate plans, those are for a decade or more with renegotiation terms. It's just providing that perspective that, hey, yes, we are putting strain on the grid, but we are also charging, and this is a service to the community. This is an amenity, and that's how we get the rates down. And it's just a back and forth. Some utilities are more amicable and they understand it, they get it. They've been looking into this while. Small municipal ones that weren't really aware of it, it wasn't on their radar, not really a concern of theirs. That's where you get some of the crazier off the chart numbers, and it's good to have a team dedicated to start having those conversations now and often.
Yeah, I think, and my question was a little bit more about what on the front end when the consumer is actually going to charge. So there's a lot of different apps, there's a lot of different interfaces when you get to a charging station. Is that starting to streamline at all, or are there,
I'll take care of that. Okay. So, short answer is no. One of the major reasons why is the best way I can describe it is, so when we're talking about a gas powered vehicle, it's plug and play. You just pop in the fuel, let it rip, it's pumping, you're good to go. EVs are computers on wheels. Take your smartphone, stick some wheels to it. That's what you're dealing with an EV. You're dealing with a ton of software that has to communicate back and forth with each other to allow the hardware to work. There's a lot of proprietary information. And one of the biggest problems, especially for our big automakers, they're not vertically integrated. What makes it's so easy for Tesla to do this is because they vertically integrated everything. They have the proprietary software for everything else. While Ford, GM, and a lot of the other manufacturers, they have a bunch of different parts from a bunch of different companies. So they got their prices down, and they all have to now have contractual agreements to get them all to communicate with each other. So then you add another layer of your own software or your own app and things like that. Then you have to get contracts in place for certain term limits to get access to that software, to have the chargers to be able to effectively communicate with them back and forth. The only difference is if you dumb down the system. So it's getting the charger, and the only other operative is you have the charger that you literally pay and it plugs in. But the chargers still have to be able to communicate, and the car has to be able to communicate with that charger, saying like, we recognize this software, we're going to allow it to charge us. So that is an ongoing thing. L2s, because they're simpler technology, make it a lot easier. But a lot of L2s also, there's a lot of, depending on the jurisdiction, requirements to manage software communication and make sure those are staying operational, that if it communicates, you have cell signal that it can tell, hey, we're down, we're running into an error, all this other stuff. But that is a major hurdle that's still taking place within the industry. And a lot of the major auto manufacturers are realizing that too, is that we have to negotiate those terms. We have terms with all the OEM partners that allow us and our systems to communicate with it. And other companies are doing the same thing. It just takes time. Otherwise, it's a more delayed process in order to connect. So just plug and go is much more complicated, and it's going to take some time before that can happen. I was literally just brainstorming last night about this. Maybe one day we'll get to the point there'll be like it's like magnetically syncs and be like, yes, I'm a car. Just give me this much juice this fast. One day.
Great, thank you. I will say that there is a comment in the chat that's asking about, they're saying our subscription for our current level 2 chargers will be ending next year, and we're looking for recommendations for other manufacturers or services. So I'll say that if there's any communities on the call that you have recommendations for the city of Shoreview, feel free to put those in the chat while we answer a question about, the question is, we are looking for our local electric, or working with our local electric utility and landowners to get installed our first EV charging station in town. This will be in a small business district. While this may be a simple question, what is the best way to determine the appropriate location for this station? Whether that's in a parking lot or in the right of way.
Yeah, so generally, it's not usually approved to build a station in an existing right of way. There's also usually setbacks on parcels themselves where you're not approved to even build within a setback. So you might have to be. A lot of places have 25-foot, let's just say 25-foot setbacks. So chargers themselves might be considered a building and a building setback. So you actually have to more or less build it in parking lots. Which is probably what you'd want to be looking for anyways. That's not to say that you can't use the right of way as part of the easement run to provide power to that site, but for the most part, you're not going to be approved unless if you give your own self an exemption or an exception to build in a right of way. It's going to be mostly beyond the setback, which when you get surveys taking of the property, they'll show you all the existing easements, any setbacks on the property themselves, but you should be looking for a spot in a parking lot And I know I said you want to build as close to the outer edge of the property as possible because it's easier to tie in with power. There are situations where you might have to go in a parking lane or a driving aisle or so just to get out of those setbacks. So something to consider there. Tommy, anything on your end?
I mean, you said it all. I mean, that's generally what we're looking for too. We really recommend parking lots. It's a lot easier structure for them to pull in. It's more comfortable. Dinner went away. I recommend it.
Great. I want to thank you both, Tom and Mike, again for joining us today. We are at time, so I want to be respectful. I do have one just reminder slide for folks as we wrap this up, that you should have received an email or will be receiving an email from Lindsay about the verification and kind of end of program information that you should be knowing. And so I would encourage you to read that email. If you haven't returned your verification tracker to us yet so that you can get certified, please do that. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And as always, we will be sending out the great information that Mike and Tom covered today in the slides out, as well as have it posted on the EV Smart website, the recording and the slide deck. So keep an eye out for that as well. And if you need to reach any of us, these are our contact information, and I will, if it's all right with Tom and Mike, I'll include your emails in the follow-up email in case you have any questions for them.
Definitely.
So, thank you all for joining us today, and have